next unit. This next unit that we're going to be covering here involves the respiratory and excretory systems. Just so you know, respiratory involves breathing, so we're going to be talking about how that works, the mechanics of that, as well as taking a look at the lungs and a variety of other parts to your respiratory system. Your excretory system involves peeing and your kidneys and a few other parts as well. And one of the questions that we're going to have on our next unit test, which won't be until after we do both systems, one of the questions that we're going to have is, why are we covering breathing and peeing at the same time? What theme do you notice as we work through these two systems, respiratory and excretory? There is a reason why we're covering them both at the same time. Many textbooks, in fact, cover them in the same chapters. And so as you're learning about these two systems, I want you to keep that question in mind. Why are we covering both at the same time? What themes do you notice? On the front side of your notes, you have a diagram that shows the respiratory system. What we're going to do is we're going to be labeling certain parts within there, but also looking at the mechanics of how this all works. So just make sure you have your note packet available. First, purposes of the respiratory system. One of the purposes of the respiratory system is to be able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide gas, to bring oxygen into the body and to get rid of carbon dioxide gas that we produce. This means that the respiratory system is going to be closely tied with the circulatory system. When we breathe in air and we bring that oxygen into the body, we want to transport that oxygen to cells that need it, and so that means we're going to have to transport that in the blood. In addition, you're going to learn within this unit how the body produces carbon dioxide gas, and that carbon dioxide gas produced by all the different cells in your body will need to be transported through the circulatory system back to the lungs. And so it's kind of hard to talk about one without describing the other. Another purpose of the respiratory system is to be able to convert monosaccharides, or at least get the energy out of monosaccharides, and convert it to an energy form that we can use. This is going to be in the second part to the respiratory system. We'll cover this at some point next week. It does require oxygen. We're going to be showing you a demonstration that involves a Cheeto and burning it, and how there's a lot of energy that's there in that Cheeto, a lot of sugar energy. How are we going to get that energy out? Again, relying on oxygen. So two different purposes of the respiratory system. One, to bring in gases that we need and get rid of gases that we don't need, and another to finally explain to you why oxygen is so important. As I mentioned, you have a variety of different parts to the respiratory system that are shown in the diagram on the front side. They are numbered, same numbers that are in the notes that you have. And so as we work through this, if you want to refer to the diagram, that's great. You don't need to necessarily label the diagram, though it's not a bad idea. But I'm just letting you know that as we work through the notes, number 1 and number 2 and number 3 are in the same order in your notes and in the diagram. First item up for bids in your notes there, first item shown you in the diagram are the nostrils. Nothing special about the nostrils other than that's where air comes in. Certainly air can enter in through the mouth, but there are some benefits of breathing through the nose that we'll mention with our next part. And that next part is called your nasal passage. The nasal passage, the benefit to breathing through your nose is that the nasal passage is there to be able to filter, to warm, and to moisten the air. Filtering it is great because that means that the air has been cleaned a little bit of all the bacteria and fungus and mold and viruses that are out there that are trying to get in. In addition, if the air is warm and if it's moist, then it's going to have a better chance of going from the lungs into the circulatory system. So you can breathe through your mouth and it will warm it, moisten it a little bit, but it's not going to do you as much. It's not going to do as much of the filtering process. From the nasal passage, the next place is where kind of the mouth and the air from your nostrils kind of meet. And number 3 is your pharynx. The pharynx is the back of your throat. Number four we introduced to you a little bit in our last unit with the digestive system. Number 4 is the epiglottis. It prevents food from entering the trachea. When you are breathing, that epiglottis should be in the up position, allowing air to go down into the lungs. And when you're swallowing, the epiglottis should cover that next part up, this trachea, so that food is directed down the esophagus into the stomach. The epiglottis is a flap. The flap covers an opening called the glottis. That term or that prefix epi means about or above. And so this flap that is above or near or on top of this opening called the glottis, that's how it gets its name. Anyway, the glottis is the opening to the trachea. Number 6, still not officially in the trachea. There's a picture that shows the epiglottis and in the up position, air coming in down the trachea. But anyway, number 6, not officially in the trachea yet. The larynx is number 6. It's the voice box, and that voice box has vocal cords on the inside. I'm going to play for you this little video here. Give me a chance. So what you're going to see in this video here, we're going to take a look at a video that shows someone's voice box, someone's larynx. So we've got a cord that's been placed in this person's mouth with a camera on it. The camera has also got a strobe light, so it's going to appear to slow the vocal cords down a little bit so we can get an idea of what's going on. And what's going on overall is that this individual is being asked to sing at different pitches. And as she sings at higher pitches, the vocal cords are closer together. At lower pitches, the vocal cords are farther apart. And being able to control those vocal cords is really important to a singer. In this case, the singer was having problems with being able to form certain notes and pitches, and so getting an idea of what the vocal cords were doing would be a way to help that individual out. But anyway, vocal cords inside the larynx. Trachea now next. Trachea is your windpipe, and this trachea has rings of cartilage around it. These rings, shown in the diagram here, are there to help support the trachea. The esophagus doesn't have that, and your esophagus doesn't need that. In fact, you don't want your esophagus to have that extra support, because you want your esophagus to be able to undergo peristalsis, to squish and squeeze and push that food along. But you don't want your trachea to close, because if that trachea closes, then you can't get oxygen into your blood, eventually down in the end of your lungs, and you can't get rid of excess carbon dioxide. So that trachea needs to stay open. And that's what those rings of cartilage are there to do, is to provide extra support. Number 8, as we work our way down, we're going to branch off into the right lung and then also the left lung. And the division point, those two largest tubes, are called your bronchus, or at least bronchi for plural. You have a right bronchus and a left bronchus. They are the major branches from the trachea. As we work our way further down, they divide off into brachial tubes or bronchial tubes, so smaller divisions of the bronchus. And then they get even further divided, so smaller and smaller pathways. So the trachea and the bronchus and the bronchial tubes eventually dividing off into bronchioles. So going back to that picture for a second, here's the bronchial, so even smaller pathways, and they are all over the place in the lungs. They're just zooming in on one pathway. But the smallest divisions of the bronchial tubes eventually ending up in little tiny sacs that are called alveoli. So here these alveoli are enlarged in this picture, little tiny sacs where each one can fill with the air that's being breathed in. They are dead-end sacs. The air from outside the body to inside the lungs can't go any further without going into the circulatory system. And to be able to get the air into the circulatory system, these alveoli are very, very, very thin. They are thin so that gas exchange can happen very rapidly. If they were thick, then gases wouldn't be exchanged rapidly. That oxygen in your lungs wouldn't get into your circulatory system too quickly. And so we do want these alveoli to be as thin as possible, paper thin. The alveoli exchange those gases. So here's a different image of the alveoli. But those gases are exchanged with the capillaries that are here, these pulmonary capillaries. And so the pulmonary capillaries, gas is exchanged from the blood to the lungs. So air would come into these alveoli and then diffuse across the membrane into the circulatory system, where now the blood can transport oxygen to cells that need it. So capillaries, gas exchange from the blood to the lungs. There's that picture again. And then number 13, I'm going to show you a model of this and show you a description of how this diaphragm works. But your diaphragm is a muscle at the bottom of your rib cage that helps you to be able to breathe. You can't pull air into your lungs. You can't swallow air into your lungs. Instead, this diaphragm that's down here is going to pull air, in a sense, by creating a larger space in your chest cavity. I've got a model that'll show you this, and so for the moment, the muscle that is below the lungs that helps with breathing. Number 14, we've learned about this one before. Here's that diaphragm again. Number 14 is the esophagus. It's part of a lot of the different respiratory system pictures, and so the tube from the mouth to the stomach. And then surrounding your lungs is a membrane that's called the pleural membrane. This membrane that's there helps to keep air inside the lungs. It surrounds the lungs, and as you breathe in, the air is kept inside the lungs a little bit longer. And so you really don't want to get your pleural membrane damaged. If somebody were to have been in an accident or been stabbed, if their lungs were punctured, then that pleural membrane can't function to keep air in, at least at that spot. And as air goes in through these different pathways, the nostrils and nasal passage and pharynx and all the way on down, as you pull air in using that diaphragm, it would leak out through that pleural membrane if it's damaged. And so if somebody does have a damaged pleural membrane, it's important to make sure that that pleural membrane is sealed up. So a variety of different parts. Now more so a question of how do those parts work? And what is it that we're trying to breathe in the first place? When you think about the air that we breathe in, it's filled with a whole bunch of different gases. Do you know what gas is most common? See if you can kind of think this one through. When we take a look at the air that we breathe in, the components of it, 78.084% of it is nitrogen. So most of the air that we breathe in is filled with this nitrogen gas. And we don't do anything with the nitrogen. It's there, but it's nothing that we actually need. But we have no choice of what to bring in. We just take a breath and there it is. The next most common gas is oxygen. Almost 21% of the air that we breathe is oxygen, followed by argon and then carbon dioxide. That these four together account for about 99.998% of the air that we breathe in. Carbon dioxide is a very tiny percentage. The other gases that are there are a whole bunch of other gases, and I suppose it depends on the environment that you're in as well. If you're closer to a factory or a car exhaust or something, some of these other gases would increase or decrease as a result. But I do want you to jot down in your notes in the air in section the percentages, and you can go with a rough percentage, 78% and 21 and 1 and so forth. And just for nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide, I should say. And then once you write those down, I want you to make a prediction about what you would anticipate seeing in the air you exhale. So when you breathe in, these are the percentages in the air that surrounds you. But when you exhale, you're going to exhale air out. What number will you see? And I'm less concerned about the number than maybe making a prediction about whether that number will be higher, lower, or the same as what was there to begin with. So for example, with nitrogen being 78% of the air that we breathe in, when you exhale, will that number be higher, lower, or about the same? Make a prediction, and then when we do a demonstration about this later in class, I'll have you come back to this and we'll figure out together if that's correct or incorrect. So we're going to test your prediction by collecting some data in class. How breathing works. You have a chart here that shows inspiration, which is breathing in, and expiration, which is breathing out. I'll show you the model and show you how this diaphragm works to bring air in. But step one of breathing in is the diaphragm contracts. When the diaphragm contracts, that means it's being pulled into the down position. And by being pulled down, you're increasing the volume in your chest cavity. And by increasing your volume, you're decreasing the pressure, and that means the air that's higher pressure outside the body is going to be moving into lower pressure area inside the body. So, step 2, by pulling that diaphragm down, the chest volume increases, your chest pressure decreases, and air moves from high pressure outside the body to low pressure inside the lungs. Inspiration. By changing the position of the diaphragm, we change the pressure, and air is always going to move from high to low pressure. When you expire, when you breathe out, the whole process just reverses. In the expiration process, we first relax the diaphragm. That's going to cause the chest volume to decrease. The diaphragm is going to be in an up position. And as I show you this model later on, this chest volume decreasing is going to cause the chest pressure to increase. Just like if you were squeezing on something, you're going to be increasing the pressure, which is going to force the air out. Air moves again from high to low pressure, but this time out of the lungs. It's all based on how the diaphragm moves. And when you lose your breath, when somebody kicks you in the gut or you get hit in the stomach, that diaphragm is partially paralyzed, temporarily paralyzed. And by paralyzing that diaphragm, it can't contract, it can't relax, and as a result, air isn't going in or out temporarily. Once you start to regain use of that diaphragm, you can then contract it and relax it, causing air to move in or out. Gas exchangers, things that we've already learned about to some extent. Remember, it is very closely tied to your circulatory system. So the pulmonary artery that leaves the right ventricle is heading towards the right lung and branching off to the left lung too. It's bringing blood that is low in oxygen to the lungs from the heart. Once we get to the lungs, we have to start to zoom in on those lungs and those pulmonary capillaries that are present, again shown here. The pulmonary capillaries in blue are going to diffuse that carbon dioxide from high to low concentration into the blood or into the alveoli. In addition, the air that's coming in that's rich in oxygen, the oxygen-rich environment that's in your alveoli, the oxygen is going to diffuse from high to low concentration into the pulmonary capillaries. And so at that point, that's where this diagram is showing blood as being red. However, please know that your blood is never blue. It's only slightly less red than when it's filled with oxygen. Anyway, once oxygen has been diffused into the pulmonary capillaries, then oxygen can be transported back to the heart through the pulmonary vein, bringing blood that's rich in oxygen from the heart back to the lungs. And so here in red, the pulmonary veins bringing blood back to the left atrium, left ventricle, and back out. Any carbon dioxide that's been diffused into the alveoli would head through the bronchioles, the bronchial tubes, and on back out eventually, out through the nose or out through the mouth. In order to transport all those gases, oxygen carried by hemoglobin, that protein that we've learned a little bit about, carries oxygen within red blood cells. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, there is no special protein to carry it. It's simply just dissolved in the plasma. And so whether the red blood cells are bringing oxygen to cells that need it, or when cells produce carbon dioxide gas, it's just dissolved in that plasma. You've got another gas though here, it's CO. And CO is not Colorado, but it's not carbon dioxide, di meaning that you have two oxygens, but it's carbon monoxide. Mono meaning one oxygen, monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a dangerous gas because it binds to hemoglobin really tightly. In fact, given a choice, hemoglobin will always bind to carbon monoxide instead of just oxygen. The problem is that if you can't deliver oxygen to your cells, because all this hemoglobin is bound up with carbon monoxide instead, if you can't deliver oxygen to cells, you can't get the energy out of sugar. So carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas, but it's very dangerous because it can cause you to initially feel tired and then pass out. And if you have a car, the one place that you should never start it is inside an enclosed garage. Your car produces carbon monoxide gas. The odor that's there is because of an additive that's been given to your gas so that you can kind of smell it. But if you start that car in an enclosed garage, your car will, or your garage will fill up with carbon monoxide gas, and you'll eventually pass out and not wake up. Unfortunately, very recently, there were some kids near a pool at a hotel. The heater to the pool started to malfunction, and unfortunately, a couple of the kids ended up dying because of carbon monoxide exposure. To be able to reverse it, if someone's still alive, you'd have to get them out of the carbon monoxide rich environment and into a chamber that has excess oxygen. That excess oxygen will eventually replace the carbon monoxide that's bound to the hemoglobin, and even then it may take some time, sometimes upwards of 2 to 3 weeks. Average breaths per minute. All right, so I want you to take a moment. I want you to do this like we did for measuring your heartbeat, your pulse, right? But this time all you have to do is be able to get to this point where you can count your number of breaths. There's no point on your wrists to measure or anything, but get a moment, find out how you're doing with your breathing, and I'm going to give you 15 seconds. During those 15 seconds, I want you to count how many breaths you are able to take, and then we'll calculate. So on your marks, get set, go. And stop. That's a little bit harder, isn't it? A little bit harder than trying to figure out how many beats per minute. I mean, it was hard maybe to find your pulse when you had to do that. But once you found it, it wasn't too bad to count that. But breaths, that's a little bit different. Because once you start to think about it, measuring how many times you breathe, well, was I supposed to take a breath then? Would I normally have taken a breath then? If you're thinking about it, breathing becomes a little more difficult. More on that in just a second. But the average number of breaths per minute is somewhere around 18. In other words, if you were coming up with a number that was somewhere between 4 or 5 in your 15 seconds, don't forget to multiply that by 4, you'd get about 18 breaths per minute. Of course, if you're exercising and all that stuff, that's going to change too. But it's very hard to measure the number of breaths per minute because you're thinking about it, you're conscious of it. So how does your body know when to breathe and when not to breathe? When to breathe faster and when maybe not so much? Well, the way that that works is through a part of your brain called the medulla. The medulla is a portion of your brain that is right at your brain stem, a very basic part of your brain. All organisms have a medulla. They need one in order to know when to breathe. And that medulla is connected through nerves to your diaphragm. And it's also connected through nerves to the different arteries and veins that you have, arteries in particular. And what your brain will be able to sense or measure at that point is how much carbon dioxide is in the blood. The carbon dioxide changes the pH of the blood. It makes it more acidic. And as a result, that measurement is going to be sent back to the medulla and sent on to the diaphragm to say, hey, we need to speed up to get rid of that carbon dioxide, or slow down because, well, there's not that much carbon dioxide present. When someone is short of breath, breathing into a bag, they're going to be breathing in more carbon dioxide, which is going to adjust their breathing rate. Air volumes in the lung. Well, that's stuff that we're going to cover as part of a lab activity tomorrow. So at this point, the notes are done. We're going to be taking a look also at different respiratory system disorders eventually. We also want to take a look at a couple different demonstrations today. So once everyone's done with the notes, we'll we'll get more information through these demonstrations. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, you're done with the notes.